My mother-in-law tried to poise *N me during an important family dinner after I announced my pregnancy because she didn't want me to marry her son. But her plan failed, and now she's going to jail. I never thought the happiest moment of my life would also be the most dangerous. I know that sounds dramatic, but trust me, there's no better way to describe what happened that night. It all started with a family dinner that was supposed to be a celebration. Both families were gathered to share news I had been keeping close to my chest for weeks. I was pregnant. It was a moment I had dreamed of, imagining the joy of announcing it to loved ones who would be just as thrilled as I was. But as I would soon learn, not everyone was as delighted as I had hoped. From the moment I met my mother-in-law, I knew she didn't like me. Her passive-aggressive remarks were constant. "My son is so lucky he chose you, even though he could have aimed higher." Or, "Are you sure you can handle being with someone as accomplished as him?" Over time, those little jabs became a background noise I had learned to tolerate. But until that night, I never realized just how far she was willing to go to get her way. The dinner started off fairly normally, though with the usual tension that accompanied any event where she was present. We had reserved a long table at an upscale restaurant with warm lighting and an air of sophistication. The family was seated along the table. My fiancé beside me, his parents across from us, and a mix of cousins, uncles, and aunts filling out the rest. I had hoped that, with so many people around, things would remain civil. Couldn't have been more wrong. The moment of truth came when it was time for us to make our big announcement. My fiancé, glowing with happiness, stood up with a glass of wine in hand. I had wisely avoided alcohol, of course. "We have something special to share with all of you," he said, smiling in a way that briefly made me forget all my nerves. "We're going to have a baby." The table erupted into cheers and congratulations. Well, most of it. As I scanned the faces around me, I locked eyes with my mother-in-law. There wasn't a hint of joy in her expression. Instead, her face was rigid, her smile tight and forced. Her icy stare bore into me as if I just announced I was taking her son to live on another planet, rather than the fact that we were bringing a new life into the family. "What an interesting surprise," she finally said, raising her glass of wine as if to toast a funeral. The rest of the family continued celebrating, but the atmosphere around her felt colder than a walk-in freezer. I tried to brush it off, focusing on the genuine warmth and excitement from everyone else. But something about her demeanor set off alarm bells in the back of my mind. The dinner progressed, and on the surface, everything seemed fine. That is, until the main course was served. The waiter carefully placed beautifully plated dishes in front of everyone, and soon the room was filled with the sounds of forks and knives. Everyone except me, that is, my mother-in-law, with an overly sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes, suddenly spoke up. "Oh dear, I just realized you can't eat this. Some of the ingredients might not be safe for the baby. Let me order something special for you." Before I could protest, she had already flagged down the waiter and was whispering something to him. I don't know how to explain it, but the entire situation felt off. It wasn't just her sudden show of concern. It was the way she said it, with a subtle undertone that felt less like kindness and more like control. Minutes later, the waiter returned with a different dish, one she had personally requested for me. "This is much better for you," she said, her smile now resembling that of a predator watching its prey. The dish smelled unusual. I couldn't pinpoint what it was, but the aroma was unlike anything else on the table. My fiancé, engrossed in a conversation with his cousin, didn't notice anything, but I couldn't stop staring at the plate in front of me. Was I being paranoid? Was I letting my complicated relationship with her cloud my judgment? I decided to play it safe. Pretending to eat, I discreetly pushed the food around on my plate while observing the others. My mother-in-law, seated directly across from me, didn't take her eyes off me. Her smile was gone, replaced by an intense, almost expectant look. That's when it hit me. A sudden wave of nausea, followed by dizziness so strong I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from toppling over. I tried to stay composed, but my vision blurred, and I knew I had to get away from the table. I mumbled an excuse about needing to use the restroom and stood up, noticing how she exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible gesture with her husband. It felt like they were sharing some unspoken message. In the restroom, I splashed cold water on my face, my mind racing. Could it have been the food? Was I sick from something I'd eaten? As much as I tried to dismiss the idea, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply, dangerously wrong. When I returned to the table, her eyes locked onto mine immediately. In that moment, I knew this wasn't a coincidence. She was up to something. The walk back to the table felt like an eternity, even though it was only a few steps. My head was spinning, not just from the dizziness, but from the storm of thoughts crashing through my mind. Could my mother-in-law really be this twisted? Or was I just being paranoid? I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that this was just my imagination fueled by years of tension and her constant disdain. But that look, that cold, calculated look she gave me as I stumbled toward the bathroom wasn't something I could easily ignore. When I sat back down, it felt like an invisible spotlight was shining on me. Conversations at the table flowed on, laughter and toasts that felt completely out of place with the turmoil inside me. My fiancé continued chatting animatedly with his cousin, blissfully unaware that my world was beginning to crumble. But it wasn't his fault. How could he suspect anything? Even I wasn't entirely sure. My mother-in-law, on the other hand, didn't take her eyes off me. She watched me with a mix of expectation and cold indifference, like she was waiting for something, or someone. "Feeling better, dear?" she asked suddenly, her tone so sugary sweet it nearly made me gag. I forced a smile and nodded, trying not to betray the chaos raging inside me. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me vulnerable. I decided not to touch my plate. I excused myself, saying I still wasn't feeling well and preferred not to eat anymore. For a brief moment, her face tensed, just for a fraction of a second, but enough for me to notice. Then she recovered her mask of sweetness and shrugged. "Such a shame. This dish is perfect for pregnant women. But of course, your health comes first. Don't worry about a thing. I'll handle everything." That "I'll handle everything" echoed in my mind like a sinister mantra. I couldn't just sit there and say nothing. I needed to confirm or dismiss my suspicions once and for all. Taking advantage of a moment when my fiancé was distracted, I quickly texted a friend who worked as a nurse. "If someone feels dizzy and nauseous after eating, could it be food poisoning?" I wrote. I knew it wasn't a very specific question, but it was the best I could do without raising suspicion. Her reply came almost instantly. "Yes, but it could also be something else. If you think it's food poisoning, go to the doctor immediately." "Why? Are you okay?" My heart began to race. I needed to get out of there, but I couldn't just stand up and announce that I thought my mother-in-law was trying to poison me. How do you explain something like that without sounding crazy? So, I did the only thing I could think of. I waited. I observed. I searched for any sign to confirm or refute my worst fears. The rest of the dinner was agonizing. Every time someone mentioned the pregnancy, my mother-in-law found a way to derail the conversation or make passive-aggressive comments. Having a child is a huge responsibility. Not everyone is ready for it, even if they think they are, she said at one point, looking directly at me. I felt anger bubbling up inside, but I forced myself to stay calm. There would be time for confrontations later. When it was finally time to leave, I noticed her approaching my fiancé with a triumphant smile. She whispered something in his ear, but he just laughed and shook his head, clearly not taking her seriously. "Mom, please, we've talked about this," he said loudly before kissing her on the cheek goodbye. I couldn't wait to get out of there. In the car on the way home, I tried to act normal, but my mind kept replaying everything that had happened. My fiancé noticed my silence and asked if I was okay. "Yeah, just a little tired." I lied. I didn't want to alarm him until I had concrete proof. Still, I couldn't resist mentioning how odd it was that his mom had insisted on preparing a special dish for me. He dismissed it with a laugh. "You know how she is. She always has to meddle." Maybe he was right. Maybe I was overreacting. But something inside me told me I wasn't. That same night, while he slept, I searched the internet for symptoms of poisoning and went over the evening's events again and again in my mind. The pieces were starting to come together, but I still needed definitive proof. I decided to save a sample of the dish my mother-in-law had sent me. No one had cleared the plates after dinner, and the food remained untouched in the container she had served it in. I carefully sealed it in a bag and, the next day, took it to a lab for testing. The wait for the results felt like an eternity. Every minute dragged on, and my mind kept conjuring darker and darker scenarios. When the call finally came from the lab, the confirmation hit me like a punch to the gut. The food contained traces of a substance that, in small doses, could cause dizziness, nausea, and even serious complications for pregnant women. There was no longer any doubt. My mother-in-law had tried to poison me. The lab results hit me like a ton of bricks. The confirmation that the food my mother-in-law had prepared contained substances potentially harmful to my pregnancy turned suspicion into a chilling reality. It was official. She had tried to poison me. At that moment, my entire world froze. She wasn't just a manipulative woman or a controlling mother-in-law. She was someone capable of doing something truly monstrous. After receiving the lab's call, I sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, staring at the report with trembling hands. I didn't know what to do first. Confront her? Tell my partner? Go straight to the police? My heart screamed at me to act quickly, but my mind begged for calm and strategy. A part of me wanted to storm into her house and scream the truth in her face, but that wouldn't solve anything. This required precision, not impulse. The first thing I did was take photos of the report and secure multiple copies in different places. If this woman had proven anything, it was that she had no boundaries, and I couldn't risk losing the evidence. I also decided not to tell my partner yet, not because I didn't trust him, but because I knew his close relationship with his mother could lead to an emotional reaction that would complicate things. This situation called for careful planning. I spent hours researching online about similar cases, what steps to take, how to approach the authorities. I learned that I'd need more than the lab report. I needed to build a solid case. So I gathered every text message, every phone call, especially those where she mentioned the dinner and the special dish she'd made for me. Everything began to piece together, a clear timeline of how she had tried to harm me. But as I collected evidence, my anger grew. Who did she think she was to decide I wasn't good enough for her son or to put my pregnancy at risk? Memories flooded back. Her barbed comments disguised as concern, those disdainful looks, and her constant attempts to undermine our relationship. It all culminated in this, a chilling attempt to assert control. The next day, I took a decisive step and sought legal advice. I needed to know how to proceed without jeopardizing my safety or that of my unborn child. The lawyer I consulted listened intently and assured me that this was a serious matter that shouldn't be taken lightly. The lab report is a key piece of evidence, he said, but we'll need more to ensure she can't wriggle out of this. He also warned me against confronting her directly without legal or police support. His advice was clear: gather all evidence and file a formal complaint. With this plan in place, I felt a bit calmer but still anxious. Part of me couldn't believe this was my reality. Life, which should have been filled with joy over my pregnancy and the excitement of building a family, had turned into something out of a suspense thriller. But there was no turning back. Now, it was about protecting myself and ensuring this woman faced the consequences of her actions. That night, my partner noticed my distant demeanor. "Are you okay?" he asked, his concern genuine. It was hard to keep everything bottled up, but I couldn't drop this bombshell yet.
I am justired, Elid.
The pregnancy is taking more out of me than I expected. He seemed to accept my explanation, but I could see the worry in his eyes. What he didn't know was that later that night, he received a message from his mother that would unknowingly add another piece to the puzzle. He showed it to me as we were having dinner. The message seemed innocent, but to me it felt like a veiled confession. "How's my dear daughter-in-law? I hope she enjoyed the dinner, though she did look a little pale. Maybe she should rest more." The way she worded it, that passive-aggressive tone she always used, felt like she was mocking me, as if she knew exactly what she had done and wanted me to know it too. Inside, I was boiling, but I forced a smile and told him to reply politely. I couldn't let him suspect anything just yet. Now I had even more reason to act swiftly. Her arrogance would be her undoing. In the days that followed, I noticed how my mother-in-law carried on as if nothing had happened. She continued sending passive-aggressive messages, planning family gatherings, and playing the drama queen. But she had no idea I was steps ahead. Every word she said, every action she took, became part of my growing file of evidence. I was inching closer to ensuring she paid for what she'd done. I knew a direct confrontation was inevitable, but it would be on my terms, not hers. The clock was ticking, and my plan was taking shape. What she didn't realize was that, this time I held all the cards, and I had no intention of showing her any mercy. When the moment finally came to act, I felt a mix of nerves and determination. I had gathered everything I needed: evidence, medical reports, screenshots of messages, and even the haunting memories of that fateful night. I knew my decision would not only affect my life, but also my partner's, who was still unaware of the storm about to hit. However, I couldn't let fear hold me back. What was at stake was far greater: my well-being, my baby's safety, and our future. The first step was sitting down with my partner and telling him everything. I'd avoided this conversation for too long, scared of how he might react. Would he believe me? Would he try to justify the unjustifiable? But I knew that if I didn't come clean, our relationship might not survive this. One evening after dinner, I asked him to sit with me on the couch. I told him there was something serious we needed to discuss. I don't know how to begin this, but I need you to listen without interrupting, I started. His face tightened, but he nodded, signaling he was ready to hear me out. I showed him the lab report, the messages his mother had sent, and recounted, step by step, everything that had happened that night. At first, his reaction was disbelief. "Are you saying my mom tried to poison you?" he asked, as if the words didn't make sense. "That's exactly what I'm saying," I replied, keeping my tone as steady as possible. I explained how my symptoms that night weren't a coincidence, how I consulted a doctor and had samples tested. I pointed out how his mother's behavior afterward, those sarcastic, taunting messages, seemed like a veiled confession. "I don't want to believe this," he muttered, burying his face in his hands. "But the evidence is here. I can't ignore it." I watched as he wrestled with himself, torn between his love for his mother and the undeniable reality of what she had done. It was heartbreaking but necessary. Finally, he looked up at me and said, "What do you want to do?" His question gave me a sense of relief I hadn't expected. I had feared he would defend her, but instead he was ready to support me. I told him I had already consulted a lawyer and that the only way to handle this was to press formal charges. He nodded slowly, though his face betrayed deep pain. The next day, we went to the police station together. Filing the report was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Reliving every detail in front of an officer, laying out the evidence, explaining how someone who was supposed to be family had done something so vile, it was emotionally exhausting. As I spoke, I could feel the weight of my emotions bearing down on me, but I forced myself to keep going. When it was over, the officer assured us they would act swiftly. I felt a small burden lift off my shoulders, though I knew the real battle was yet to come. The police handled the rest. They issued an order for my mother-in-law to come in for questioning. When she received the notice, her reaction was immediate and, predictably, dramatic. She called my partner in a rage, accusing me of spreading lies to tear the family apart. She claimed I was manipulative and that this was all some twisted revenge plot to ruin her life. My partner, though visibly shaken, told her firmly that he had seen the evidence and wasn't on my side because I'd manipulated him, but because she had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. The news of the case quickly spread among family members. Some were horrified by her actions, while others, unsurprisingly, tried to excuse her. "She's an older woman. She didn't know what she was doing," some said. "Maybe it was all a misunderstanding," others suggested. But I refused to let anyone downplay what had happened. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate attempt to harm me and jeopardize my pregnancy. When my mother-in-law was called in to give her statement, I chose not to be there. I didn't want to see her, didn't want to face her theatrics or crocodile tears. But my partner went. He told me later that she initially denied everything, but when presented with the evidence, the lab results, the messages, her demeanor changed. At first, she tried to blame others, claiming someone else must have tampered with the food or that this was all a setup against her. But eventually, when cornered, She began to cry and beg for forgiveness. That forgiveness, however, wasn't genuine. It was the kind of apology you give when you're caught, not when you feel true remorse. My partner saw through it, and that realization broke something in him. "I can't believe you were capable of this," he told her before walking out of the room, not looking back. With her partial confession and the overwhelming evidence, the case moved quickly. My mother-in-law was arrested and charged with attempted poisoning and endangering the life of an unborn child, which added a level of severity to the case. While part of me felt sympathy for my partner and the impact this would have on his family, another part of me was relieved. For the first time, she was facing the consequences of her actions. Still, I knew this wasn't the end. While the legal system was taking its course, the emotional scars of what had happened would linger for a long time. The only thing I could do now was focus on protecting myself, caring for my baby, and ensuring I never found myself in such a situation again. The sentencing day felt like both an ending and a beginning. As it approached, I was overwhelmed by a mix of emotions. Part of me wanted it to be over, while another part dreaded reliving the pain and betrayal. I sat in the courtroom with my partner, who had stood by me every step of the way but was visibly shaken. Across from us sat his mother, my mother-in-law, whose expression alternated between arrogance and fear. The trial brought every detail to light, no matter how painful. The prosecution laid it all out. The plan to contaminate my food, the calculated effort to sabotage my relationship, and the clear intent to harm my pregnancy. Each word struck like a blow, reminding me just how close we came to a disaster. I glanced at my partner. His face was taut, his fists clenched at his sides, his eyes fixed on the floor. The most dramatic moment came when the judge asked my mother-in-law to speak. She rose with a demeanor that can only be described as smug. "It was never my intention for things to go this far," she said, her voice dripping with false regret. "I was only trying to protect my son from making a rash decision. I didn't realize." I almost laughed. She didn't realize? That was her excuse for endangering my life. My baby's life? The judge was unimpressed. After hearing both sides, reviewing all the evidence, and considering the severity of her actions, he delivered a verdict that left the courtroom silent. My mother-in-law was sentenced to prison for attempted poisoning and endangerment of life. Her lawyer scrambled to appeal, citing her age and emotional fragility. But it was futile. The sentence was firm, and justice would finally be served. When I heard the decision, I didn't feel immediate relief or triumph. Instead, a strange emptiness settled in me. I wasn't seeking revenge. I just needed assurance that I was safe and this nightmare was over. Yet, as we left the courthouse, I began to feel a flicker of hope. It was as if I could finally start looking forward again. My partner, however, was devastated. While he supported me throughout the ordeal, this shattered his relationship with his mother and forced him to reevaluate his family. I tried to console him, but I knew this was a grief he had to navigate on his own. Over time, though, our bond grew stronger. If there was any silver lining to this ordeal, it was the realization of how much we valued and needed to protect each other and our unborn child. The aftermath rippled through his family. Some relatives tried to downplay what had happened, claiming it wasn't that serious or that prison was too harsh for someone her age. But whenever someone attempted to justify her actions, I reminded them how close I came to losing everything. I made it clear that I wouldn't tolerate any guilt-tripping or forced reconciliation. This was my life, my health, and my family she had jeopardized, and there was no room for excuses. The following months were challenging but also liberating. Slowly, I reclaimed the peace I had lost and focused on preparing for the arrival of our baby. Together, my partner and I built a home filled with love and trust. Reflecting on the events, I still felt chills, but also immense pride for standing up to such darkness and emerging stronger. Today, as I hold my baby in my arms and watch my partner's face light up as he plays with him, I know the struggle was worth it. My mother-in-law remains behind bars, and though I know she'll eventually be released, I also know she will never have the chance to interfere in our lives again. This experience taught us the value of resilience and the importance of protecting what truly matters. This story didn't end with a fairy tale happy ending, but with an invaluable lesson. Sometimes, To protect what you love, you have to face even the most terrifying battles, no matter the cost. And that lesson, though hard-earned, gave me the strength to create the future I always dreamed of.